Get ready, because the real estate industry has just implemented some of the largest changes that we have seen for buyers and sellers in about 100 years.
A revolutionary change in the always volatile housing market.
Earlier this year, the National Association of Realtors agreed to a class action lawsuit settlement of $418 million. And although this is a really big number, the bigger changes came in ways of new rules and the way that commission or compensation, as you're going to start hearing it called now, will be paid. And these changes are going to affect everyone in the transaction, the buyer, the seller, and the real estate agent. Now, before we get too far down the road, I want to start by saying that NAR, or the National Association of Realtors, did not and still does not set commissions. And commissions were negotiable before the settlement. When are we going to see all these changes take place? Well, they have already taken place, but they started on August 17th. And if you have additional questions after you listen to all this, make sure you post them in the comments down below or reach out. I am happy to answer anything. So let's talk about what the major changes are, how it affects everyone in the transaction, and what your options are, both from the buyer standpoint and the seller standpoint. And I have also been reading in a few different platforms and forums some of the confusion and questions that people have about all this. So I'm going to bring some of that up as well, just to help clarify. First off, MLSs or multiple listing services will no longer require listing brokers to offer commission or compensation to buyer's brokers in MLS. And any offer of compensation to the buyer's broker has to be kept out of MLS. It cannot be displayed on the platform at all. What this means is that no longer can agents see what the other agent is offering in commission. Now, something that seems to be confusing for some consumers is that not long ago, there was a new ruling that came that said that all the portals have to start advertising what that buyer broker commission is. And this was all in hopes to be more transparent so that buyers could see what sellers were offering to their agent. Removing this altogether has been puzzling for some consumers, but it makes sense when you really look at what the ruling does. It has decoupled the buyer and the seller's compensation. Now, the sellers paid the seller's agent and the buyers paid the buyer's agent. This is a very big change. What it does still allow is cooperative compensation, or the seller paying the buyer's agent, as an option for consumers looking to buy or sell a house, as long as these offers occur outside of the MLS. I'll get more into this one in just a little bit. What this means for sellers is that when you meet with a listing agent, you will negotiate the compensation that you will pay them. During this conversation, pay close attention to how they negotiate for themselves. This will often reflect their ability to negotiate on your behalf. From there, another conversation needs to be had about what, if anything, the seller is willing to pay the buyer's agent. During this conversation, it is really important for sellers to fully understand what this means and how it could affect the sale of their house. With regards to this, the seller has a few options. The seller can agree to pay the buyer broker compensation at the time of the listing, or they can say that this is something that will be negotiated at the same time that they negotiate on their home sale, meaning that during the negotiation for your home, you are also negotiating for the buyer broker compensation. Now, something that most everyone has voiced a concern about is that if sellers are not offering compensation, there are some buyers that will not be able to buy a home because they can't come up with the additional money to pay a buyer broker. And this could mean that some buyers miss out on a home that they absolutely love, all because they just don't have the additional money to pay their buyer's agent. Now, could the buyer go directly to the listing agent so that they don't have to pay a buyer broker fee? They could. But at that point, they would have to do one of two things. They would either have to sign a document that says they're agreeing to dual agency, meaning that that listing agent represents both parties. However, their fiduciary responsibility remains with the seller, or they would have to sign an unrepresented buyer addendum, meaning they have no representation at all. Now, I know for some, they will think, well, that's not a problem. I don't need any help. I can do this all on my own. And trust me when I say I completely understand someone saying that. However, I have also had quite a few clients who have bought and sold multiple homes over the years that are highly educated. Look at me at the end of the transaction and say, we could not have done this without you. Why? Because things change, they evolve, and new situations will come up in a transaction. And when you're working with a full-time professional real estate agent, it is our job to stay on top of all of this. We know what to look out for. We know how to protect our clients with something that might seem benign to you, but could become a major issue. We also have a deep Rolodex to get things done really quickly. I know I will be challenged on this one, and that's okay. But I also know that for some that feel they can go it alone and save some money, they will end up after the transaction feeling like something went wrong and now they need an attorney. And it's going to end up costing them more money than had they just had representation. I've seen this happen before. Now, the biggest change for buyers is that now it is a requirement to have a buyer-broker agreement signed before you even go look at one house with a real estate agent. Now, in some states, this was already a requirement, but here in Arizona, it wasn't. And I don't know a lot of agents that actually utilized it. Now, this agreement must clearly define what the compensation is and confirm that the compensation is, in fact, negotiable. Now, this new rule does have some consumers confused as to why it's so important to sign this document before you look at any homes. Many of them are concerned about whether this agreement locks them into working with a specific agent, which is causing some apprehension. And for those that find an agent via one of the portals and you have a brief conversation with them on the phone, meet them at a house, only to have them shove this buyer-broker agency agreement right in front of you to sign before you walk in, well, I would be apprehensive about that too. But here in Arizona, we have another option, and it's called the buyer-broker agreement to show property. This can be for a day, it can be for a week, it can be for an hour, it can be for any length of time that you choose as long as it's very clear. This gives the buyer and the agent a chance to get to know one another and see if you're a good fit. Now, although these rules were not really in effect until August 17th, we here in Arizona have been implementing these rules since August 1st. And I have already been contacted by a few buyers who are working with other agents, and they were never given the opportunity to sign the agreement to just show property. They were told they had to sign the buyer-broker exclusive agreement, which they were not comfortable with. And I can truly see both sides of this because it's new. But the whole goal of all of these new rules and the new way of doing things is to be more transparent. And if an agent isn't giving you all the information, that is a red flag. It's also a red flag if they can't answer your questions about any of these things. So make sure you're asking questions and make sure they're able to answer them and make sure their answers are clear. I do think and actually hope, in all honesty, that this weeds out some of the less ethical agents that we have in the business. We have already seen some of the fallout because of this. Now, something I do think we're going to start seeing are agents that start charging for a showing, or they're going to charge per hour. Some will do this and say, well, if you sign a buyer exclusive agreement with me and you buy a house, I will discount that amount that you've already paid me off of the compensation at the end when you close escrow. The reality is we are just going to start seeing different ways of compensation. Now, a question that I have heard because it's come up is, what about open houses? You as the buyer do not have to sign anything for that agent at an open house. This is seen as different. The agent there is working solely on behalf of the seller. So if you have an agent at an open house that's telling you you have to sign a showing agreement before you can come in, that is a red flag because this is not a requirement. Now, I want to go back and just talk a little bit more about the decoupling of the compensation and how it affects buyers. Because as soon as buyers hear that they are going to be responsible for paying their agent's compensation, with all the money that they have been saving to buy a house, this feels like a little bit of a setback. But as I said earlier, the seller can still agree to pay the buyer's agent's compensation. And honestly, I believe this is how it's going to be most of the time. The real change comes, as I said, is that it is no longer listed in MLS. So now as buyer's agents, we have to find out what the seller or broker is offering. And whatever agent you're working with needs to communicate that back to you as the buyer so that you are fully informed. Now, here's where it's going to get tricky. And really good agents are going to be able to negotiate this on your behalf. Some sellers are going to say they're paying nothing, or that it all depends on what the offer looks like. And the buyer's agent is now going to have to communicate this back to you as the buyer, so that again, you are fully informed on what this means and how it affects you. Many buyers will then think, well, now I can't buy the house. However, there is another document that we can include with your offer that asks the seller to contribute to the compensation. Now, some buyers and some agents, by the way, are going to think, but the seller already said they're not paying anything. Or maybe the thought is that they're going to pay next to nothing. Some sellers are going to be told to say no to the compensation to use it as a negotiation tool. This is when we can add that document in and see what the seller will actually contribute. If the seller is really willing to do nothing, they will counter back, removing this. But this is still not the time to give up if it's the house that you love. There are always ways to figure these things out. Maybe you get the seller to agree to some of the compensation so that you don't have to pay the whole thing. What I really think is that sellers will quickly realize that if they are not paying any compensation to the buyer's agent, their buyer pool dwindles pretty quickly. So the reality of this is that it's a lot of new paperwork. We've got to figure it out. And hopefully a lot of people don't get sued in the process. Now, if you would like to learn about homes you absolutely should not buy, make sure you take a look at this video. As always, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.